Okay, well, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at our third Caron Sage Mining User Group, otherwise known as MUG. Hope everybody's got a nice mug of coffee this morning. I wanted to welcome you this morning and look at our agenda. My name is Paul Caron. I'm the CEO of Caron Business Solutions, and today's speaker is Robert Lavery, the president of Robert Lavery and Associates, who represents several products that enhance Sage 300, and today we'll be speaking about the Orchid group of products. So just a little bit about the mining user group. We really believe that there's a lot of benefit to our clients who are 100% mining companies coming together and learning about products that are of interest. We hope in the future we can start to meet in person and have some chit chat around coffee or lunch and talk about mutual experiences and learn from each other to strengthen community and strengthen your use of Sage software. So we'll continue having these throughout the year. We'll take a break in the summertime and a break at Christmas, but looking at about 9 sessions every year. And as a matter of fact, next month we're going to have a couple of sessions. So let's look at the agenda. This morning, or maybe afternoon for some of you, we are going to be having the Orchid product review. So Orchid's a software developer, longtime software developer for Sage 300. They have many products that they've written that we've relied on over the years and our customers have relied on, and a lot of very interesting developments to really improve the solution. So Robert's going to run through some products, in particular EFT processing, some inter-entity transactions, which are very important for many mining clients, and talk about report runner and process scheduler, which are some of the more powerful features of the products. And after that, we will have questions and answers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Robert Lavery.
Thank you very much, Paul. And again, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Caron User Group presentation today. Thank you very much for your investment of time, and we hope that you will find these presentations useful today. As Paul mentioned, we're focusing on a few solutions from a company called Orchid Systems, whose main claim to fame is really automating and streamlining a lot of the processes within Sage 300 that can either be time-consuming or costly because of the amount of labor and additional administration that might be required. And just to put things into context, our organization acts as the North American distributor for Orchid Systems. So we take care of Canada, the US, Mexico, and the Caribbean. And where necessary, we can also work in South America because we know some of the mining operations actually do work in South America. So we work closely with Caron Business to help design and position some of these solutions when Caron clients are facing some difficulties or looking for ways to save time or money around their Sage 300 system. And so we thought we would start with the most popular product. This is actually our #1 selling product called EFT Processing, or Processing if you're American. And what we're doing here is essentially we're replacing the need to produce paper-based checks, and instead we're going to create an EFT file that you can upload to the bank website and make payments electronically to your vendors. Now, all of these products that we're going to be talking about today are written in what we call the SDK, or the Software Development Kit for Sage 300. The significance of that for you folks as existing Sage 300 companies is that, as you can see, these products embed themselves directly into the Sage 300 menu structure. So they're fully integrated and operate just like any other Sage 300 module you might be running today. But in addition to that, they support all of the system manager services, which includes the common services module for things like multi-currency, optional fields, tax services, bank services, and the fiscal calendar, as well as the administrative services, so that when you dump and load your database for backup and security reasons, The EFT, the inter-entity, the process scheduler tables will also be part of that same Sage 300 database. The other thing that's important to note is that we also support the standard security groups that control access rights for your users within Sage 300. So whether it's EFT processing, inter-entity transactions, process scheduler, all of these applications support the standard security groups. And we're going to come back to this in just a moment because this is a very important aspect of maintaining the security and integrity of sensitive banking information that you're going to need in order to produce electronic payments to your customers and your vendors. So you'll see how we can segregate duties between a person who sets up the vendor details versus the person who approves those vendor details. So as I say, I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes as we start to walk through the options. But just as a high-level overview, it's important that you understand how tightly integrated these applications are with the rest of Sage 300. So when it comes to EFT processing, there's a few things that we have to understand in order to configure the application. And that is, when we're integrating, you're still going to use the same accounts payable, invoice, and payment process that you're using today. So you'll enter your invoices as you do now, you'll set up your payment batches as you do now, but instead of printing a paper-based check, you'll actually be creating an EFT file. In order to do that, you need to tell the system some of these configuration options. So starting off with the first one, you have a choice between whether you create an EFT file against a range of payment batches or whether you want to be able to produce one EFT file for each payment batch that you create. Now, the answer will likely be predicated on how your bank is going to charge you for the EFT file transactions. In some cases, the banks or financial institutions will charge you based on a file upload, regardless of the number of transactions included. If that's the case, then you want to say yes, so that you can put as many different transactions into that one file as possible. So you want to be able to incorporate transactions from multiple payment batches. But if you're getting charged based on the number of transactions, then a lot of clients choose to say no, so that they have a one-to-one relationship between a payment batch and an EFT file that they upload to the bank. The next option is whether or not I want to allow unposted batches to be part of the EFT file. Now, best practices would suggest that you say no to that option, because as you're probably aware, when you create an unposted batch, if you make any changes prior to posting, those changes are not recorded in the ACPAC Sage 300 tables. So unless you've got an audit logging tool, you would not know what those changes were. So by and large, most of our clients will say no to that option, but we added it to the software because there were some valid cases where customers needed to use unposted batches. The next option has to do with when I'm creating those payment batches, do I want to skip the check vendors and only include the EFT vendors because I've created a payment batch that has both EFT and non-EFT vendors in the same payment batch? Or am I creating a payment batch that includes only EFT vendors? So if I find a non-EFT vendor, I need to display an error message and stop the creation of the EFT file. Now again, best practices would suggest that we try to segregate the payment batches between EFT vendors and non-EFT vendors because it creates a nice, clean audit trail. And how do we do that? Within accounts payable vendors, the master file allows you to attach a payment code to each of the vendors. So what we recommend is that here on the processing page, you might have check as a payment code, you might have credit card, but what we would suggest is that you change that payment code to EFT for your EFT vendors. And then if you create your payment batch using the create payment batch function, you have the ability to use as criteria the payment code to isolate your EFT vendors from your non-EFT vendors. This ensures that only EFT vendors are part of the payment batch, and therefore all of those vendors can be used as part of the create EFT file process. Now, again, it's not necessary to do that, but it's just an option for you if you'd like to do that. Okay, so just wanted to highlight that as one potential way of doing it. Now, you might also be familiar with the fact that within bank services, when you set up your banks, you can also create a unique series of document numbers for EFT versus check payments. And this is another way that you can create a nice clean audit trail. Because it's using a different check form, you can also use a different series of check document numbers. And that way you've got not only segregated payment batches, but a different series of check numbers that are applied for EFT electronic payments versus your standard paper-based check payments. Again, not necessary, but in terms of creating a nice clean audit trail, it would be considered a best practice. So those are a couple of the initial options that you have. Now, as you're creating the EFT file, a lot of people worry that when I start going to electronic payments, I lose flexibility in how and when I pay my vendors. But that's not necessarily the case. We give you the option to allow selective payments from within a payment batch. So when I'm creating an EFT file, let's say I choose this batch here, number 62, I can choose, if I turn on that option, instead of paying all of the payment transactions, I can select individual entries from within the batch by flagging them with an X to include them in the EFT file. So just because I've created an EFT file doesn't mean I have to upload and pay all of those payments right away. I can make selective choices from within the batch and upload just those payments for payment. This also gives rise to another consideration, and that is whether or not your bank will process the payments based on a transaction date. We have 3 different dates that determine when the payments are actually sent to your vendors. One is the batch date within accounts payable for the payment. One is the EFT file creation date. So if it's today's date, April the 21st or 22nd, then it will upload and pay right away. But in some cases, the banks will allow a transaction date to be used for the processing date for the electronic payment. And if that's the case, then you can actually upload the file today, but not have the payments go until next Tuesday. So you can post date checks, or payments rather, by changing the transaction date. And in some cases, the bank will allow you to have different transaction dates within the same EFT file, and they will process the payments based on those transaction dates. So you've got lots of flexibility in when and how you pay the vendors, even though you're using an electronic file to do so. So I just wanted to highlight that for you to make sure that you're clear that you're not restricting yourself in any way just because you've chosen to use electronic file transfer to pay your vendors. Now, this also gives rise to concerns around security and privacy of the information. So in order to do that, I mentioned that we want to be able to create a segregation of duties, and we can use the administrative services security groups to do that. And one of the ways is by setting the default vendor status to entered. So what are we referring to? Well, you have your AP vendors set up, and when you introduce EFT into your Sage 300 system, you now have to add your vendor's bank name, their financial institution number, their account number, and the account name that they use. In order for you to send payments, though, to these EFT vendors, the status has to be active versus just entered. So in order to create some security around the setup of new vendors for EFT purposes, if you choose to set up the option that when they're first entered, they just have the entered status, and then you have someone else go in and change their status to active within the EFT vendor screen, which is what we see here, you can have one person doing the setup of the vendor and another person changing their status to active. And this is where the admin services security groups come in. As I mentioned off the top of the presentation, one user would be assigned the ability to view vendor EFT details, and another user would be given the rights to approve those vendor bank details. And when you do that, it forces one person to set them up and another person to create the the EFT vendor record. So that's one way that you can get the vendors set up in the system and maintain proper security. Now, a question just came up about currencies, and that's an excellent question. Because AP payment batches within Sage 300 can only support one currency at a time, EFT files are generated on the same basis. So if you're paying a US dollar vendor, you can't mix that with a Canadian dollar payment to a Canadian vendor. So the banks are going to enforce running one currency per EFT file. So in the case where you're generating multiple payment batches with different currencies, you would have to create different file types for that, which actually raises an excellent question about the bank file formats. And I'm going to come to that in just a second after we finish the discussion around the setup of the vendors. Because the other thing we do, in addition to having the default vendor status entered versus active, is that we have logs to record every time you set up a new vendor. So when you set up the vendor, we can log the date and the time when that vendor was set up, the details about the vendor name and number, the user within Sage who set up that vendor, and the details. And then you'll see at some point, the other person will be able to go in and change the status from entered to active, so the old value to the new value. So any changes will also be recorded as part of this log. And this can be generated as a report, but in this case, I'm just showing you the inquiry. So it should give you some level of comfort that you've got control over who's being set up to get paid electronically, because you can segregate the duty between who sets up the vendor and who approves the vendor for payment. But we're also logging all of that data being set up in the system through the EFT audit log. The other thing we do is we create a log around EFT payment files being created. So as you're generating your EFT files, we're going to assign a unique EFT creation number, add the date and the timestamp, identify it as an AP payment batch, and then identify the batch number, the user who created the EFT file, against which of the banks, where that file is stored on the network, and the dollar value of the transactions within that EFT file. And then if you wish, you can double click and download a detailed listing of all the payments that are within that EFT payment batch. And that's one quick way that you can identify the payments that were set up within that file and the vendors who were paid. So all of this information is available to you online, and this log ensures that you've got a test for completeness and continuity for all of the EFT files that were created. Now, how do we get all of this set up correctly? Well, we move to the EFT banks. With the EFT banks, we'll take the existing bank information that you have, and then we will attach a file type to that bank. Now, the file type is what we call a specification from the bank that determines what kind of information needs to be part of that EFT file, where it's placed within the file, and whether there's any check digits, hash totals, or other marks that provide extra security around that payment file. Now you'll see, depending on which bank you use, if we use the example here of Royal Bank, you can see that there's a number of different formats, even for just one bank. And that's because they support different types of electronic payments, and they also support different payment types. So for example, you can do an RBC Express wire payment, you can do a basic check payment, you can do different currency payments, you can also support internet banking, you can do Interac e-transfers, You can do credit card, you can do PayPal. So there's no limit on the type of transactions you can support as long as your bank supports those types of entries. The key is that you need to get the specification from your bank that identifies the file layout that's required in order to use that specific service and those types of payment transactions. So if you decide you want to implement EFT as a solution within your business, you have to start by asking your bank for the specification for the file type that's required. And then you'll know which file type to attach to your bank, and you'll be able to upload payment transactions, and they'll go through the bank system automatically and electronically. So that's really important that you take note of that in order to use EFT. And that's typically probably the most challenging part of setting up a system, is making sure that you've got the correct file type and ensuring that the bank can process those payments for you effectively. Now, once you've done the EFT payments, we also have some additional security routines. And one of those is encrypting the vendor bank account details and putting password control on the remittance advice. Because what we're going to suggest to you is that now that you're making payments electronically, that you also email the remittance advices electronically. So we support email transmission in bulk to all of the vendors that you've sent an electronic payment to. So in order to do that, as part of the EFT vendor setup, you will have to determine whether you want to use the email address that you add for the EFT vendor, or whether you would like to use the email address based on the existing AP vendor delivery methods. So if you're not familiar, within AP vendors, you have delivery methods that are either email or contacts email. If you choose email, then it will pick up the email address on the address page. If you choose contacts email, it will be the email address on the contact page. So either one of those are valid, or in the third case, you can use the email address that's attached here to the EFT vendor. So either one of those will be valid email addresses. And if you have more than one contact, then you just simply use a semicolon and say paul@caron.ca. And you can add a second or even third person to receive these remittance advices. Okay, and that will be dependent on whether or not those email addresses are more than 60 characters in total. Now, it's also possible to import the bank information if you think that will be easier for you. So as you gather the bank information from your vendors, you can put that into a spreadsheet and then import that information in if you think that will expedite for you. But that's essentially the process of getting EFT set up to do electronic payments, setting up the bank information for your bank file type, setting up the vendors with their banking information, and then choosing the options for how you want to generate the EFT files and whether you're going to use encryption. Now, to show you the encryption, we will go ahead and print an advice so you can see what they look like. The system can generate hard copies of the remittance advices. So I'll just show you quickly what they look like. These are standard crystal forms, so they can be modified if you don't like the standard format that we've provided in the software. But you'll notice that the bank information for the vendor has been encrypted, and then it's up to you as to how you format the data. So in this case, we're going to list the document details with an invoice number, date, and amount, and then the total amount of the remittance advice. So these remittance advices can be generated and printed, but of course, once we're doing electronic payments, we don't want to then have to print, fold, and stuff and mail these remittance advices to our vendors. We want to be able to send them electronically. So rather than printing, we'll use the vendor customer email details, and then we can also create our own email message. So this is the last setup option that we need to consider, where you can go in and create an email template to put in the wording that you want when you're sending notification of payment to your vendor. And you can include different variables for payment date, payment amount, document list, contact name, or other pertinent information. And once you have that, you'll be able to go ahead and print, and instead of printing to the screen or a printer, you will actually email these remittance advices. But in order to provide an additional level of security, then you can add your own password formula so that only the person who has the password will be able to open that remittance advice and look at the information around your payment details. All right. So that's what EFT processing is all about. If they have any questions, I'd invite you to pose them through the chat right now, and I'd be more than happy to address those. Okay, now we did have this question about US vendors. So with different currencies, as I mentioned, you would have to choose a different payment batch and use an EFT file that does support US dollar currency payments. And what you'll find with some of the Canadian banks is that they use a different currency code. 22 will be US dollars, 32 will be Canadian dollars. But it's important to note that when you're setting up the system, the EFT file formats can be supported for banks anywhere in the world. So it really doesn't matter where your vendors are. They can be based in the US, they can be based anywhere in Europe, Asia, doesn't really matter. We have over 750 different file types based on different banks, different transaction types. You can see we also support positive pay, where you're still producing paper-based checks, but you send a file to the bank to verify which checks have been produced. And we've talked about wires. We can do PayPal. We've done PayPal for a few companies. I mentioned credit card. I need to clarify what I meant by that. We are not an actual merchant account. In other words, we're not authorizing the credit card payment. We're just processing the credit card payment. So you would still need a merchant account in order to authorize the payment against a vendor's credit card. But other than that, we can support the payments as long as your bank has a specification document to support that type of payment. Then we'll be able to include it in the software. And if you're running a current version of Sage 300, which right now is 2019, 2020, and 2021, if we need to add a new file type for a different specification, we do that at no charge. All right, so there's no additional cost if you're running a current version of Sage 300 if we need to add a new bank file type. And to be honest, we do add a couple of new bank file types almost on a monthly basis because banks are constantly updating their routines, putting in security around their files, or just more banks are adopting EFT transactions to avoid check fraud or identity theft. And now, because of our pandemic, people not being able to get together and work in the office, it's difficult to get signed checks. We have the ability to support multiple file types. So this checkbox here, allow multiple vendor bank account details. You check that box, and then what happens is on the EFT vendors, an additional field will appear with a file type. So rather than just a remit to, there'll be a file type, and you'll be able to add a particular bank file type for this vendor, and then you set up a second vendor record and add the second bank file type. So you can choose which of the banks that you want to send payment to based on the file type that's required. So thank you for that question. We do support multiple bank accounts with one vendor if necessary. All right, then we will move along to inter-entity transactions. So with inter-entity transactions, our goal is to streamline the generation of the due to, due from intercompany loan account entries. For any organization that has to do expense allocations, such as rent, telephone, if you charge management fees, anytime there's a cross-company transaction, without a product like inter-entity transactions, you're forced to make entries in one company and then mirror entries in a second or third company. And that obviously is quite time-consuming. And it also means that you then have to reconcile intercompany loan accounts at month end or quarter end. And that can be a very time-intensive process. In fact, many of our customers have told us that they're saving 2 days a month not having to manually reconcile the intercompany due to and due from loan accounts. So how do we do that? Well, within inter-entity transactions, what we're doing is we're actually balancing the debits and credits by the individual segments. So this would require that you have one of your GL segments identified as the entity or company. So in order to do that, you either have to add that or it has to be existing. And then once you've identified that segment name, you set up segment codes for each of the various companies that you want to allocate expenses or revenue to. Now I'm going to show you a very simple example of allocating an expense off of an AP invoice, and we'll show you how it automatically sets up the loan account entry so that you don't manually have to set up the due to and due froms, because we've already predetermined the relationships between the entities or the related parties. And then we've also specified the transaction route that tells us how we need to move the entry from one company to another. We can also clear entries through management companies or holding companies, and sometimes this is done for tax reasons. All of those different scenarios can be supported. And because some of the entries are going to separate Sage 300 company databases, we can map to those different company databases the entity code that's set up within the general ledger. And then you can choose to auto post those entries when they hit the general ledger of the what we call the target company. So I'm going to show you the due to, due from entries first. And I'll also then show you how you settle the due to, due froms using a bank transfer or whenever you want to move money between the companies. And then the last part of the presentation on inter-entity, I'm going to show you a more advanced inter-entity transaction where instead of leaving the loan account entries in the GL, we actually create an offsetting AR invoice and AP invoice. So rather than just doing a bank transfer to settle loan accounts, you can actually do an AP payment against an AR receipt and settle invoice transactions in the subledger. All right? So that's what you have to look forward to. And this is what we call accounting magic, folks, because we're going to be doing things automatically for you, just like magic. So to start with, we're going to create an AP invoice in what I'm going to call entity 1. And we're going to allocate, let's just use the example of office supplies expense from one company to another company. So it'll be an intercompany allocation of office supplies expense. Intercompany allocation of office supplies. And you'll see that I'm just doing a standard AP invoice entry. The nice thing about inter-entity transactions is that it does all of its work behind the scenes so that you don't have to worry about it. Now, what you're seeing on the right-hand side here is a different solution called Document Management Link. Particularly in an intercompany environment, but possibly in using EFT, you might want a copy of the invoice to justify why the payment is being made in EFT or why you're sending an allocation of expense to another company. And this, because these documents are stored outside of the Sage 300 database, you can store it once in a folder or in a Dropbox or in Microsoft's repository in Office 365, Google Docs, anything that you can think of where you can store documents. You can link those to any field within Sage 300. So as I set up a document number, you can see all the invoices for vendor 1200 are here. But as I set up an invoice 830, you can see I've already got that stored here. So let's try 831. Oh, there we go. And it creates a new window for me to store that document. And then if I want to add it, let's say it's been scanned or set up as an email, I can grab, and you notice this is called Jaguar. When I drag it over into the window, it renames it to invoice 831 to match the details in the document number field. And then wherever this transaction goes, I can have that invoice attachment supporting the transaction. Now, the other thing I want to highlight here is the use of distribution sets. Distribution codes allocate expenses to one GL account based on a description. The distribution sets allow you to allocate an amount to multiple accounts. So when I hit create distribution, you see it does the two accounts automatically for me. So it's a nice way to save time in data entry and an efficient way to ensure that you're doing the allocation correctly. Now, if you remember, I talked about the importance of the segment code. The -1, -2 denote which company I want these expenses to be allocated to. So my invoice total is $2,000, and I want to keep $1,200 of that expense here within company 1, but allocate $800 of that expense to company 2. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to eliminate the tax. Now, of course, here in Canada, we have a value-added tax system, so you would typically maintain the input tax credit in the company that's going to make the payment of the external AP invoice to your outside vendor. But it might be, based on your own internal accounting policies, necessary to allocate the tax as well as the base amount of the expense. But for demonstration purposes, I'm going to keep the tax out of it and just set up the standard AP invoice transaction. And that's all there is to it. I've entered the AP invoice, and the only thing that I've done differently than what you might be doing today is I've allocated the expense between two different expense accounts. So now I'm going to go ahead and I will post that invoice batch up to the general ledger, and it will create my GL batch. So to this point, inter-entity transactions hasn't done anything for you. We've just entered the AP invoice, set up the GL transaction batch, and this is standard Sage 300 accounting processing. So there's the entry for today, April the 22nd. And when I open up the batch, you'll see that it's allocated a credit amount of $2,000 to the accounts payable trade control account. And you notice the source ledger is APIN because it came as an AP invoice batch. Now, what's going to happen is that when I post the transaction, a couple of things need to happen. Because right now, even though I've got debits and credits of $2,000, inter-entity sees this transaction differently. It sees a credit of $2,000 to the AP trade control account in company 1 and a debit of $1,200 in company 1. So within company 1's books, I'm actually out of balance by a debit of $800. Likewise, for company 2, I've got a debit of $800 with no offsetting credit. So in order to alleviate that situation, inter-entity adds a couple of lines to the transaction batch. It will add an intercompany receivable in company 1's books that's due from company 2 of $800. And then in company 2's books, it will create an intercompany payable due to company 1 of $800. And it will assign an IY source type to identify the fact that inter-entity has created these transactions automatically during the posting process. And this is the accounting magic that we referred to, okay? So this happens automatically so that I don't have to manually set up or reconcile the due to, due froms anymore. When I post this transaction, it will generate the loan account entries. And then because company 2 is a separate database, it will export those transactions over to company 2. So there's exporting to company 2. And then you will see the loan account entries appear. All right. So let's take another look at what inter-entity just did here for you. So we identified the fact that we had our AP invoice batch coming in with a $2,000 credit to the AP trade control, and then the expense in company 1 of $1,200. And then inter-entity balanced the entries through the loan accounts by adding a line in company 1 for a receivable due from company 2 of $800. And there's my balanced entry within company 1. And likewise for company 2, the office supplies were offset against an intercompany payable that's due to company 1 of $800. So I now have a balanced entry within company 2. And then because this line and this line were exported to the company 2 database, I can then choose to reverse those entries in company 1's books. Now we show the full audit trail so you can see the in and the out, and your posting journals would show you this as well. But the net effect of the entry are the highlighted lines, the $2,000 credit to AP trade control, the $1,200 expense, and the $800 intercompany receivable. And that's the net effect of these transaction lines, all right? So what happened in company 2? Well, let's go over to company 2 and you can see what's been set up over there. So I'm going to close this company. I'm going to have to close these windows. And then I'll be able to go over to company 2. And in company 2, you will see a GL batch has been created to record the office supplies expense of $800. So when I go to GL transactions batch listing, I will see a batch created today, April the 22nd. And this will highlight for me the fact that I've set up my office supplies expense of $800 and the intercompany payable of $800 that's due to company 1. Now we also allow you to design the audit trail. So in our case, we've put in the vendor name and number, the document number, and the batch description tells me that this transaction came from Orc Limited, which was entity 1. This is now entity 2. The posting sequence of 172, and the fact that inner entity created this transaction batch. And then the entry description gives me the posting sequence, the batch number, the entry number, and the batch description. Okay. Now I could have auto posted this if I wanted to, but I'd left it open. So you could either leave it open or auto post it so that no changes can be made. You know, if this was a different currency GL, how would the system handle that? Well, this would come over as a Canadian dollar source amount and be converted to a US dollar home currency equivalent. So if you're running multi-currency, we still respect all the multi-currency rates that you've set up, and we move the transactions over in the transaction currency, but convert to the home currency equivalent once it hits the general ledger of the target company. We're going to do the bank transfers next, and then I'll show you the second part where we can set up those entries as sub-ledger entries rather than leaving them in loan accounts in the GL. So to settle these, what we would do is we would go to Common Services Bank Services, because as part of the inter-entity setup, in addition to creating those segments, we can also do what's called cash management entries. Cash management entries will support things like bank transfers. It will also support payments when we receive money or when we make payments on behalf of related companies, okay? So I'm going to show you the bank transfer entry and how easy that is. When you go to bank services, you have a bank transfer transaction. So because you don't have an actual invoice document to settle, this is the only way that you can settle the outstanding due to, due froms. So if we do a bank transfer from Orc IN2 to Orc Limited, that would be the amount of money that needs to be transferred to settle the outstanding payables that are in Orc Inc. 2 for expenses that were incurred on their behalf by Orc Inc. Limited. So I'm transferring from Orc Inc. 2's bank account. So I'm going to use the Entity 2 bank account and move the money to Orc Inc. 1 or Orc Limited's bank account. And here again, the effect of multi-currency. So if I said it was $800, it would convert that to a home currency equivalent. Now, all I need to do at this point is post, and because we've configured inter-entity to set up the transactions, it will create the bank services entries that are required to do the deposit and the withdrawal in both companies and post them through to the general ledger. Okay, so we've automated the entire process here. So if I look at the bank entry that's created here within the source company, we wanted to pull money from company 2 and bring it into company 1. So that entry should be our last entry down here, and there it is. That is a deposit. We've put the money into our bank account. So that's a debit to the bank and a credit to the intercompany loan account. Okay, so the intercompany receivable that we set up on the first transaction has now been credited against the debit to the bank for the $800 that we incurred on their behalf. All right. Now in company 2, you would expect the opposite to happen. Because we deposited money into our bank here in company 1, we withdrew the money from company 2, and we set up the entry and posted it up to the GL. So here's the bank transaction that was created, and you would expect us to credit their bank and debit their payable to draw down the intercompany payable that we set up of $800. And that's a withdrawal. So if we drill from the GL back down into the bank services, you can see we've done the withdrawal transaction within bank services, which means the entry is going to appear on the bank rec. And that's how we automate the process of the bank transfer entry between companies, going through bank services so that the transactions end up on the bank statements, and we clear the outstanding due to, due froms in the same transaction. All right. So again, another benefit of inter-entity transactions, being able to do the entries on both companies automatically and setting up, and in this case, clearing the loan account entries so you don't have to do that manually. Now, the last transaction that I want to show you within inter-entity transactions is where we're still going to set up an AP invoice transaction, and recognize that if you were allocating revenue, we could do this on the AR side and do an AR invoice, but allocate revenue rather than expense. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to set up another AP invoice. But this time, what I want to do is not leave the intercompany amounts as loan account entries in the GL. What I want to do is use another feature of inter-entity called triggers. And the triggers allow me to take the intercompany receivable that gets set up in the loan account and say that I want to move that down into AR. So that's called an AR reallocation. And what happens is we move that debit from a loan account entry in the GL to a debit in accounts receivable to set up an AR invoice. All right. So we're going to set up an AR invoice to this customer 9994, which represents entity 4, which is going to set up a receivable to refund us for the expenses paid on behalf of entity 4. All right, so that's the first part of it. We're going to do the loan account entries by allocating the expense, but then we're going to trigger the creation of an AR invoice to offset that loan account. But then to move the transaction over to entity 4, we're going to set up an AP invoice off of the AR invoice. And this is what we call a trade transaction, where when I create an AR invoice, I can automatically create an AP invoice. And I set up a relationship between the two subledgers in my AP AR trade setup. So in this case, I'm going to do an AR invoice and create an AP invoice where we move the AP document into entity 4's database, and it's using this GL account to set up the transaction. So on the receivable side, we will debit AR and credit the refund. And then on the entity 4 side, we will do a payable where we debit the equipment lease or rent expense and credit the payable. And that payable will be payable back to entity 1. Okay, so that's the configuration that we're using in order to do this transaction. So let's do the AP invoice entry. And this is going to be an AP invoice to AR trigger to AP in entity 4, okay? So I didn't realize that's a mouthful. And I need to pick a US vendor, so I'm going to pick this vendor here, 1890. And again, you see document management link popping up on the side here. I'll use an invoice number 762. And you can see I could drag in a document there, but I won't bother. And let's say this is $500. And I'm going to use the expense account 7264-1, which was the account that we had distributed, $500, and we will add that as an entry, okay? Now the distributed total is not correct, so we need to make sure that the taxes are right. So let's go back in here, and I need 5141.25. And now we should have a balanced entry with the taxes. Okay, so just to review one more time quickly, we set up the AP invoice. We're going to post that AP invoice up to the general ledger. And then we're going to post into the GL. And when we post into the GL, that's when it's going to balance through the loan account, but then trigger the creation of an AR invoice in this company, which will then post the AR invoice, which will create an AP invoice in entity 4. Okay, so this is really a lot of magic happening before your eyes. It's kind of like pulling a rabbit out of a hat for you. So here's the AP transaction that we just did. And I'll just verify it so you can see there's the entry to AP trade for $500 and offset against the expense for equipment lease or rent. Okay, so that's the transaction that we've set up. I'm going to go ahead and post this entry, and you'll see that loan account, so the inter-entry processing balances, and then it's going to trigger an AR invoice. So there's the trigger processing, creating the AR invoice for 9994. It's going to post the AR invoice, which is what it's doing now. And then it does the AP. So the AR trade creates the AP. So all of that happened in the background. Okay. So there's my posted GL batch. And you notice there's an AR batch that shows up here because we created an AR invoice. So we have a debit to the AR intercompany and a credit for the refund of the equipment lease transaction. So if I drill down into AR from here, you'll see that an AR invoice was indeed created for $500 plus the tax. Okay, so there's the invoice the reference goes back to the original AP invoice that I set up in AP, which then created an AR invoice for the refund that's required that we're charging entity 4. So this is a customer invoice to entity 4 to get a refund of the expenses paid on their behalf for the equipment lease or rent. So the AR invoice is set up and posted through to GL automatically. But now, if we go over to entity 4, you will see that we've set up an AP invoice for $541 back to entity 1 because we owe them that money. So there should be an AP batch here for $541.25, and there it is with today's date, April the 22nd. So you know I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes. And there's the equipment lease expense that's set up, the debit for $500 and the tax, and the payable set up, a document number that's payable to entity 1. So that entire process has been automated, creating the original AP invoice to the third-party vendor that created an intercompany receivable that we set up as part of AR, which then created the intercompany payable set up in AP in the other company's database. And all of that process was completely automated for you. Now, there's a couple other things I'll highlight very quickly as we complete this section of the presentation on interentity, and that is we have created some additional reports for you as part of interentity. The first one is if you're going to be using loan accounts, you can print off a report or you can run an inquiry. So if I do the balance inquiry, this will show you the current state of all your loan accounts across all your companies up to this present moment. So it's a real-time inquiry that will show you whether your loan accounts across all the companies are in balance. And you can choose functional or home currencies, whatever you, or source currencies, I should say. And so if they're out of balance, you'll see a balance on one side that's not balanced on the other side. That's how you know you've got an imbalance between your loan accounts and the companies. But the nice thing is that once you get your loan accounts in balance, interentity will ensure that they stay in balance, because by definition, you cannot have an unbalanced entry posted in Sage 300. So once you're in balance, it will keep all of your accounts in balance. The other thing to note is that we log all of these transactions. So as you're setting up loan account entries and posting through to different companies, we are logging those to identify the source batch numbers, the entry numbers, transaction numbers, and the fact that they were properly exported to the other companies. If there are error messages, it will flag those as an error message and give you a reason why there was a problem. Sometimes it's because there's a currency mismatch and it's not set up correctly in the target company. Sometimes the account isn't set up, whatever it might be. But it will make sure that all these transactions are set up correctly based on standard controls within Sage 300. Likewise, the AR/AP trade transactions between the AR/AP subledgers, we can see all of those entries as they're being set up, and the log is there to review. The last thing to show you is that we have created consolidated AR and AP aged trial balances. So when you set up interentity transactions, you'll have the ability to run a consolidated AP aged trial balance for all your vendors across all your companies. And this is particularly useful where you have the same vendor in different companies, because this report will consolidate the outstanding balance and subtotal it by company, and then give you a grand total across all companies. And it's the same report as your standard AP trial balance, except that we've consolidated it across multiple company databases. Stop there, and if you've got any questions about what interentity transactions and trade is all about, be more than happy to answer those for you at this time.
We have clients, of course, with connectivity issues, and so they maybe have companies on different systems in different countries. And how would you handle intercompany transactions if you have different locations for the data? Can that be dealt with by transferring the data?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. Thank you, Paul. In the database entity mapping, this assumes that the database is online. So if it's an online database, yes, then we can handle that. But if the database was offline, so if we said this was entity 5 and no, it's not online, it's a separate server, separate system, then what we can do is we can create an export file path, and the system will generate an XLS file with the transactions in it that you could send to them in some secure fashion, and then they would import the transactions into Sage 300. So it is possible to still automate the process even if the Sage 300 company on the target or receiving company side is not on the same network. So the last part of the presentation today is going to cover a combined solution of process scheduler and report runner. So I'll start with report runner. And the question I have for you is, how many times do you have to go in and select the options for how you want a report to look, or the data that you want to include? And my guess is, based on other presentations we've done to customer groups, is that when you're coming in and running transaction reports, so let's say as an example, we've just talked about the trial balance for interentity purposes. If you run an age trial balance, even if you just run it twice a month. But some people might be running it every week. And in some cases, we have people running it almost on a daily basis. Look at all the options you have to choose from in order to get the report in the format and including the data that you want, right? You've got to select by certain customers and then sort by all these different criteria, and then what types do you want? What do you want to include? What's the aging period? What's the cutoff date? All these choices that you have to make. And the thing is, you're doing that manually every time you run the report. And you know what computers are really good at is doing the same thing over and over again. So why are you as a human being doing what a computer can do faster and better? So that's what Report Runner is trying to address. With Report Runner, you can take your standard Crystal reports or FR financial statement reports, and you can hard code those parameters so that AR customer aging, rather than going in and having to select all the options all the time, you go ahead and fix the parameters for what you want. So for instance, here's the aging period that I want to run all the time. So once I set the parameter, I can hide the field because I don't need anybody to change it. And likewise, you can choose other fields that you want to attach and hide those so that when it comes to actually running the report, all I need to do is click on the report, enter the customer group, and then print, and I'm done. So from a report processing standpoint, I streamlined the creation of the report by limiting the options that I have to choose or enter in order to be able to run that report. And I can do that for any report within Sage 300. I can do it for any of the third-party products that we've talked today, like EFT, where I might not even want anything to be entered. I hard code the entire report because I know exactly what I want, and I want the same report every time. So there are no options to choose. It just generates the report when I choose to hit print. So that's good as far as it goes. But now we take it one step further to say, if you want to generate these reports and not have to even go in and hit the print button, then what I want to do next is I want to schedule the report to run automatically. So I want to schedule the report, and let's say I want it to run as of a certain date and time. So we would pick a date, and I want it to run on a daily basis or maybe a weekly basis. And if it's every week, do I want it to run every third week, second week? And what format do I want it produced in, as a PDF, an XLS, or a rich text? Or am I going to just send it to a printer automatically? And it'll just generate and go to the printer. And then when I generate the file, what kind of information would I like to include? Do I want to have the year, month, date that it was produced? And if I'm sending it via email, what message do I use? Just like we saw with EFT, I can create email messages for the email reports that I'm generating. So when I run that age trial balance, I can just put in a message that here's the latest age trial balance, put in the company name or put in my name or the person's name, whatever you like. But the key is to try to automate both the generation and the distribution of your Crystal and FR reports so that you don't have to remember to do it. And the other thing that you can do as part of the setup is, in addition to emailing, you can create what's called a report group. So each of these can be separate report groups. And when we set up these reports, we can, sorry, let me go in and I'll edit for a second. When I edit these reports, I can add security and create different report groups. So you see security group A, B, C, D, E, and so on. Well, remember we talked about the use of the administrative services security groups. Well, that's exactly what these report groups do. For Information Manager, I have the various security groups. So I can assign different users to different report runner security groups to ensure that they're only receiving the reports that I want them to receive in the format that they need them in. So by creating separate report groups, I send the report in the format that's needed on the periodic basis that's needed with the information that's needed. And once I've assigned those reports, I assign the security group for those reports, and people are only getting exactly what they need. And then the last thing is, when we're scheduling these reports, as I mentioned, we could decide to attach them to the email, or we can assign them to a folder and save them in a specific folder somewhere. So when they come in, they check their folder and they see all the reports for that week or that day that they need. So that's how we would automate the generation and distribution of reports. And to automate the process as something that you can do based on a particular schedule, that's where we introduce Process Scheduler. With Process Scheduler, we can create those report groups and run what we call Information Manager reports. Those are the crystal reports, or we can run the FR financial report groups. So whether it's FR or crystal, you can decide when and how to schedule those reports. And when you run those reports and you assign them to a schedule, you can say that you want to generate an email to notify the system administrator that those reports have been generated and sent out. And you can do that all the time, or you can do it only if there were errors, or you can say, I don't need an email. They're going to get the reports as part of an email in their inbox. Okay? And you can do this in one company or across companies. So for every line of the schedule, you could run Report Runner across multiple companies at the same time. But talking about Process Scheduler, there's a number of other administrative tasks that can be automated through these schedules. For example, how many of you run your data integrity on a regular basis? I don't see too many hands up in the air, and that's because it can be a time-consuming process to do that, and you generally don't get around to it. But running data integrity, doing dumps and loads of your Sage 300 databases is an important process to ensure the integrity of the data, because there are these 0-byte files that get created within the database every time you post transactions, because the system creates a temporary file to complete the process and then doesn't use that file again. So there's no data in that file, but it's called 0-byte because it's got no data or records in it, but it does actually take up some space. And if you've ever run a defrag on your hard drive on your own computer at home or at work, you see that screen come up with all those thin lines where there's fragmented sectors on the hard drive. Well, the same thing happens on your server in your company. And by not doing dumps and loads and cleaning up the 0-byte files, you can create corrupt data or bad sectors on the hard drive, and it starts consuming disk space with useless files, and it can ultimately cause some data corruption if it's not cleaned up on a regular basis. So by running data integrity checks, it's going to ensure that you re-index the database by dumping and loading. So you run your data integrity and then you dump and load the database, and it re-indexes all the tables to make sure everything's where it's supposed to be. And then your reports continue to run and transaction files are properly updated. So all of that to say that you can schedule these processes. You can also run schedules within a schedule. So you might have a weekly schedule where you do a subset of routines, and then a monthly schedule where you combine a bunch of routines and then produce financial statements through Report Runner as a scheduled process. You can send emails, you can run your day end. For those of you that run inventory control, you can run your IC day end or your PO day end. And off the day end, you get system generated batches that you can then post, or you can just wait to post all your batches at the end of the day, and post all batches or just ready to post batches. Okay, so there's a number of different features here. For those of you that get tripped up on your fiscal periods in the calendar, you can automatically open and close periods within the fiscal calendar to make sure that you always have an open period to post your transactions. Or if you run the consolidation module from Sage, you can automatically set up the export of the subsidiary company GLs and import into the consolidated company GL. So all of these things are possibilities. And the other thing we allow is running what we call extender scripts. We don't have time to talk much about extender today, but extender is a tool that allows you to customize the business logic within Sage 300, and it has things like email alerts and audit logging and running programs or customizing screens to add fields and buttons and things like that. So you can run these scripts automatically. And let's say you want to integrate to an external database. You could automatically pull in data from an external database and populate Sage 300 without anybody having to do a manual import-export. And all of these processes are scheduled. You can decide what to do if there's an error. It will give you a date and a timestamp for when the schedule will run. And there's an audit log that's attached to these scheduled processes. So as they're running, it will tell you whether they were successful or not. And if there's a log, what's in the log. So this is a great tool to help you maintain, from an administrative standpoint, your Sage 300 system and ensure that processes are getting done on a timely basis, whether it's generation of reports, running day ends, posting transactions, whatever you can think of. But now you can schedule those as part of your system so the system remembers what to do and when to do it, and you don't have to spend time remembering. So I'll stop there because I know it's been a lot of information so far.
Robert, thank you very much for that presentation today. It was very interesting. If you want to know more, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We can get a demo specifically for you from Robert on any of these topics. Thank you so much for attending. Just want to point out that next month, we will have sessions on the new features in Sage 300, as well as some tips and tricks. And those will be presented by our newest consultant on the team, Jill Fisher. So please plan to join us. Thank you very much for attending, everyone.